This video is going to be a discussion on some of the ways that people maintain a hierarchical structure of power in society. The ideas in this video are sourced from this book called Flatland by Edwin A. Abbott. It's termed a novel, but rather than presenting a story, what it really does is to construct a world. And as the title shows, the world is basically a two-dimensional world, aka Flatland. I found this thought experiment really interesting, and Abbott is able to use this fictional construction to discuss the nature and the maintenance of power structures in human society. He focuses in particular on the dynamics between political power and knowledge. Although it was published in the late Victorian era, I think the book is able to simultaneously reflect Victorian norms and provide insight that reaches beyond its own era. Hence, this video will be discussing the political dynamics that are revealed by Abbott in this book and how it still is at play and has always been at play in various societies throughout history, as long as there are people and there is politics. To begin with, let me first introduce how Flatland is structured. All inhabitants are two-dimensional shapes, and their social class is determined by the number of sides they have. The more sides, the higher their social class. All respectable inhabitants must be regular shapes. The irregular ones are seen as outcasts and usually associated with criminality. However, women are exceptions to the rule. Women are not shapes, they're always lines, regardless of what social class the woman belongs to. So that's the basic setup of the story that we're dealing with. Now let's see how Abbott operates the setup. Now the hierarchy goes like this. The lowest class is composed of isosceles triangles, and then we have equilateral triangles and squares and etc., and the ladder goes up. Now the fact that you're born in one shape does not mean that you cannot move up the hierarchy. Let us first regard this passage. Hope is not shut out, even from the isosceles, that his posterity may ultimately rise above his degraded condition. For after a long series of military successes or diligent and skillful labours, it is generally found that the more intelligent among the artisan and soldier classes manifest a slight increase of their third side, or base, and a shrinkage of the two other sides. Intermarriages between the sons and daughters of these more intellectual members of the lower classes generally result in an offspring approximating still more to the type of the equal-sided triangle. Also, starting from the class of squares upwards, the sons of every father would have one extra side. This means that as we go down the generations of each family, there will be an increase in the social status of each generation. However, Abbott makes it obvious that the forms of social advancement for triangles are quite different from all the classes above them. The triangles can achieve this only by personal effort or intermarrying, but the other classes simply accumulate generational advancement by the mere fact of giving birth to offspring. And I think this is a very significant allegory for our actual society. The middle and upper classes are usually propertied classes, i.e. they have capital from which they can earn income, and their wealth could just accumulate itself without them having to do anything. Hence, of course, it's much easier for your child to be a step upwards of the social ladder if the wealth of your family has just accumulated itself. The working class, of course, do not have any capital that can earn them passive income or accumulate their wealth. Hence, they can only work hard themselves or form good marriages in order to advance their status. This path is clearly more difficult. Now, these mechanisms of social advancement, Abbott asserts, are clearly the most fundamental ways of maintaining a social hierarchy as such. Had the acute-angled rabble been all, without exception, absolutely destitute of hope and of ambition, they might have found leaders in some of their many seditious outbreaks, so able as to render their superior numbers and strength too much for the wisdom even of the circles. But a wise ordinance of nature has decreed that in proportion as the working class increase in intelligence, knowledge, and all virtue, in that same proportion their acute angle, which makes them physically terrible, shall increase also and approximate to the harmless angle of the equilateral triangle. By a judicious use of this law of nature, the polygons and circles are almost always able to stifle sedition in its very cradle. So the working classes are steered away from rebellion by this flickering hope of social advancement. The level of hope is just enough to keep them in line, but not too excessive to disrupt the absolute power of the upper classes. The middle classes, of course, are even less inclined to rebel because their children can naturally climb up the social ladder. As I have previously stated, women belong to a separate class of their own. They're lines. They are born lines and they remain lines their entire lives with no prospect of social advancement. This is an acute reflection of the condition of women in the Victorian era. Whilst even the lowest of men are able to advance their social status through personal effort, women are denied this completely, simply due to their biological nature. Also, because of their physicality of being lines, Abbott writes that they are deemed as dangerous for two reasons. Firstly, from certain angles, they could only be seen as dots, and this invisibility creates dangers. Secondly, their nature being lines means they have two sharp ends, and if they try to attack a male with that end, the men can easily get hurt. Accordingly, Flatland has several laws to protect men from women. Every house shall have one entrance in the eastern side for the use of females only. No female shall walk in any public place without continually keeping up her peace cry under penalty of death. Others oblige a woman when travelling to be followed by one of her sons or servants or by her husband. Others confine women altogether to their houses except during the religious festivals. These rules and perception of women reflects the Victorian attitudes towards female sexuality as dangerous. Women are blamed for their sexual appeal towards men, by nature of having such sexual appeal. Their freedoms are constrained in order to protect men from falling victim to such appeal, and we see this discourse still today. When a woman is sexually assaulted, people tend to first blame her for doing inappropriate things or dressing inappropriately, instead of saying what's wrong with the man who assaulted her. It is kind of funny in the sense that it's the patriarchy that's perpetuating this discourse. But this discourse is precisely framing men as infants unable to control their most primal desires, which is kind of ironic. Although Abbott does not mention this, I wish to just bring up one significant consequence of treating women this way. So you notice how the social structure among males are kept intact by the possibility of advancement. Females are not offered this opportunity, so via Abbott's logic, we would naturally expect them to rebel. Abbott does not portray any sort of female rebellion in his book because in his era, feminism was not yet a very widespread movement. However, from our 21st century perspective, we can look back at the trajectory of the feminist movement. I think movements such as feminism and racial equality have come so much further than movements for class equality. And you know why? Because these oppressed groups are oppressed by their biological nature. There is no way they could get out of it. They cannot advance in society if they do not change the injustice that their entire group is suffering. That's why these movements have grown so big in their influences and achieved so much. But consider movements for the working class, the proletariat. They have achieved much less, and in comparison, they can be much easily disbanded. Why? Because being the working class is not your biological nature, you can easily change that, you can easily advance up the social ladder, and by your own personal effort or some stroke of luck, you're richer. You probably are less likely to be advocating for the rights of your previous class. So I suppose there is a general principle. When you're born into a disadvantaged group, and your membership in that group cannot be changed via no matter what you do, then it's only a matter of time before equality for that group is sought. In real life, we all know that education received by the elite is quite different from all the other classes. They're typically taught things that are more abstract and less practical. The luxury of engaging in such studies is precisely a testament to their wealth and social status. In Flatland, this idea is expressed in the contrast between what they called feeling versus the art of sight recognition. So in Flatland, people needed to recognize the shapes of others, and they obviously cannot like fly up in the air and look down at other people's shapes below because they'd be like going out of their world, if you know what I mean. So the lower classes do so by physically feeling around another person to learn their shape. The upper classes do so via sight recognition. So let me just explain to you briefly how this happens. Firstly, Flatland is always very foggy. While it's a bit like London, especially in the Victorian era. And because of this fogginess, then when you see an angle, then angles appear at a different level of brightness depending on their distance from you, right? So that's say I see a pentagon, then the middle angle would clearly be brighter compared to the two on its sides that are more disguised by the fog. The art of sight recognition is a system that teaches people how to deduce the shapes of others by observing the brightness of their angles. Now, it's quite obvious that sight recognition is a lot harder than feeling somebody. This means that it requires many years of education to accomplish. Only the upper classes can afford to spend this much time and effort. Among our higher classes, feeling is discouraged or absolutely forbidden. To feel is regarded as a most serious fault. But among the lower classes, the art of sight recognition is regarded as an unattainable luxury. A common tradesman cannot afford to let his son spend a third of his life in abstract studies. The children of the poor are therefore allowed to feel from the earliest years, and they gain thereby a precocity and an early vivacity which contrast at first most favorably with the inert, undeveloped, and listless behavior of the half-instructed youth of the polygonal class. But when the latter have at last completed their university course and are prepared to put their theory into practice, the change that comes over them may almost be described as a new birth, and in every art, science, and social pursuits, they rapidly overtake and distance their triangular competitors. Isn't this a bit like in real life? You know, if you're poorer, you're likely to have less educational attainment as you need to go out and work earlier. In the short run, you are financially independent earlier, you could start accumulating your income earlier. But in the long run, when people who could afford a university education and beyond have completed their education, their earning capacity would be a lot higher. Moreover, to maintain their superior status, the elite needs extra measures to ensure that their education and their practices are exclusive. A failure to do so could lead to a blurring of class distinctions. This is why, in life, whenever an activity becomes accessible to the masses, the elite tend to abandon it and seek for another more niche activity that has not been popularized. So in the case of Flatland, the practice of painting threatened the exclusivity of sight recognition. If people painted each of their sides a different color, then anyone could recognize the shape of another person. This would render the elite education of sight recognition redundant, and that proved to be a problem. Year by year, the soldiers and artisans began more vehemently to assert, and with increasing truth, that there was no great difference between them and the very highest class of polygons. Now that they were raised to an equality with the latter and able to grapple with all the difficulties and solve all the problems of life, whether statical and kinetical, by the simple process of color recognition. So they were on the verge of rebelling against the existing class system. The government introduced a color bill, which forbid the use of painting colors. To introduce this bill, they obviously needed popular support, and this was how they gained it. Turning now to the workmen, he asserted that their interests must not be neglected. Many of them, he said, were on the point of being admitted to the class of the regular triangles. Others anticipated for their children a distinction they could not hope for themselves. That honourable ambition would now have to be sacrificed. With the universal adoption of colour, all distinctions would cease. So this is precisely the idea that I've discussed earlier. Offering people the hope, however small, of social advancement in the existing system is an effective way of quelling their desires for rebellion. In part 2 of the book, our protagonist, a square, visits a world of one dimension called Lineland and attempts in vain to explain to its king the limitations of his world. In turn, he is visited by a sphere from Spaceland, who struggles to explain the three-dimensional world to our protagonist. These episodes are very revealing of how our limited and prejudiced perspectives on the world can prevent us from seeing things which can be obvious and thinking about things in a way that have not usually been prescribed to us throughout our upbringing. It is even more interesting how the government of Flatland sets out to execute or imprison anyone who attempted to spread the so-called doctrine of three dimensions. This is something that's very characteristically done by a lot of political regimes. They work to control the flow of information from outside of their jurisdiction. This is usually done because they want their citizens to submit to the social order that they have constructed. They do not want people to be enlightened to the injustices within that order. If you have lived inside the system your entire life, it's actually quite difficult for you to independently realize how unjust it is. An external flow of information is precisely what is needed to break that echo chamber and really throw you out of your limited perspective. And this is what the government seeks to prevent. People are much more likely to submit to one system if they can't see any other alternatives. They simply accept it as the way that life should be. This is also an idea that featured significantly in my previous video, Schools Are Dystopic, which I've also linked here, where I discussed how the insulated environment created by schools can make young children believe that this is the true and the only order of their world. In fact, any sort of insulated environment has the ability to inculcate such ideas. This insulation from the outer world is precisely what enables such operation. In summary, I really enjoyed Abbott's book. It uses such an interesting setup to discuss political ideas that are always in operation in our society, and arguably they're quite intuitive and well understood, but the way that he's able to put it in the Flatland setup makes us realize it with much more acuteness. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who's interested in political ideas or just, thought experiments, interesting worlds, because, it's actually quite short. It'll be a pretty interesting read and a fast one. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video on my channel, and I will see you guys in the next video.